All right, let's get started. I see there's quite a few attendees on the call already. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johan Steyn. It's a real honor to have you all here and to learn together. Our guest today is Warren Meyer from Darktrace. He's the Alliances Director. They are the world's leading AI company for cyber defense. I think a lot of us on this call are enthusiasts or are working in the field. I am so excited about all the promise, and there's some scary things as well when it comes to this kind of technology. But just when we think we are smarter than anyone else, the bad guys are smarter than us. So, we think that our machine learning algorithms, our AI modules can beat all the hacking attempts, the cybersecurity threats, but I don't think we should rest secure. That's why we have somebody like Warren and Darktrace on this webinar today to tell us how we can leverage this technology to make sure that our corporations and our businesses are safe. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Warren. The presentation will be about between 20 and 30 minutes, and then we will spend the rest of the remainder of the hour for questions. You can post your questions in the text box, and we will get to it toward the end of the presentation. So, without further ado, Warren, welcome. We look forward to what you have to say, and I hand it over to you now.
Wonderful, Johan. Thanks for the warm introduction, and everyone, thank you so much for joining. Really looking forward to going through this. So I'm just going to quickly get my screen set up there. I've got a colleague that's going to be sharing the screen shortly, and should be up in just a second or two. But just while that gets going, I think it's always important just to frame a little bit of an agenda for the session, what we're going to be talking about today and what we're really covering. And so I think, among rapidly evolving technological advancements, there's this emergence of AI-enhanced malware, which is also making things a lot more tricky for businesses as well. And that's a trend that we're going to see going into, the next few months, next few years as well. So the focus behind this session is really to learn about some of the paradigm shifts that we are seeing, as Darktrace as a business in the broader cyber threat landscape, as well as covering some of the advancements in offensive AI, as well as looking at perhaps the most interesting side of the conversation, how we can start leveraging defensive AI in our businesses, specifically our immune system approach, which we'll talk a little bit more about, which we pioneered at Darktrace, as well as bringing in autonomous response capabilities and as part of that conversation as well. Throughout this, we'll touch on a couple of real world examples, a few use cases, and it should be a really interesting chat. So to start things off, I'd like to do a little bit of an introduction to Darktrace as a company, who we are, a little bit more about us, right? So we are the world's leading AI company in cybersecurity, founded about 7 years ago by a combination of mathematicians on the one hand, and then former intelligence experts from the likes of MI5, GCHQ, the CIA, who've now shifted into the private sector. And the whole sort of conversation about Darktrace and really where the company was born out of started when, so the story goes, a few of the security experts were sitting in a pub in Cambridge, and they said, well, we're seeing a large number of attacks starting to sort of bypass the traditional defenses. As organizations, we've been quite reliant on policy-driven, rules, signatures-based detection and response mechanisms historically. And unfortunately, in the wave of some of the new changing complexities, both in terms of how we engage with our digital businesses, but also new malware families, new attack types, etc., emerging, some of that old approach just wasn't sticking as well as it had in the past. So that's really where the concept of the cyber AI and autonomous response technologies, for which we've become so well known, actually evolved out of. Now, in essence, what we did is we created the world's first cyber AI platform. In a nutshell, it's an AI that learns what normal behavior looks like for every device on the network, every user in the cloud, things like IoT devices, users that might be behaving unusually in SaaS applications, things like Salesforce, Office 365, for example. And where we see a mathematical deviation from that normal behavior, we actually flag that in the form of alert in real time. And then as an extension of that, we then introduced, after about 2 or 3 years, on that core sort of cyber AI platform capability, autonomous response. So this is something we're super proud of as an organization. And in a nutshell, it represents the world's first AI that can take a targeted surgical response in response to machine speed attacks that might be hitting the network, the cloud, etc., and do that in a very precise way. So essentially mitigating the risk in real time and allowing the human security team time to catch up there. So having an AI block ransomware as it hits the network, for example, as a machine speed attack, it will start proliferating rapidly across the network. Our AI can actually see that emerge in real time, irrespective of whether or not we've seen an attack signature before, if it's 0 day or not, and can actually step in to surgically block only the malicious connections associated with that incident, but then still allow the different device users to continue working on email or on Excel, whatever the case might be. So there's a very powerful balance between business continuity and then proactive risk mitigation, which we as an organization were able to introduce. Now, as a result, we've done phenomenally well in the past 7 years, 8 years. We've got almost 4,000 customers globally, evaluation at over 2 billion US, and bookings amounting to over 1 billion as well. And I think it's been a really great indicator that what we are doing and what we're talking about with customers and the challenges that we're solving have really been resonating and have gone really well. All right, so I want to kick off the discussion talking about where we are right now before I shift across to talking about where we're going to be going and the whole offensive AI aspect and things as well. And then finally sort of wrapping up with looking at it. So I'm just going to jump to the next slide quickly. And I'm going to touch on a few different things here. Now, it's important to note we're still seeing this sort of continuous churn of change in the new malware families and attack types, but there are bigger trends that come out of that as well. We're still very much living in this ransomware era, right? That hasn't really gone away. Recent examples spring to mind. Garmin, they were obviously hit quite recently. Just before that, a little bit closer to home, Telkom as well. So definitely something that's still highly topical. But some of the more recent changes that we've actually seen in the way that these attacks have been perpetrated has been driven more by changes in the business landscape rather than it has by changes in the motivations and techniques of attackers. Now, what I really mean by that is, the introduction of new device types and changes fundamentally in the ways that we conduct our digital businesses. These are really opening up the doors to the attackers and ultimately driving and becoming some of the more motivating elements behind the evolution and the way that these attackers target us and our businesses. So there's a couple of key points that I really want to touch on here, and 3 in particular that really do make the most sense here. So the first is this imminent introduction of 5G, and with that, of course, greater widespread adoption of IoT devices as well. Today's digital age is one of hyperconnectivity, as we know, and that imminent introduction of 5G is going to enable connections with an average download speed of around a gig a second, just about. And that's there and thereabouts 100 times faster than the current 4G that we're with. Now, that increased speed, efficiency, reliability of 5G is going to power the surge in IoT by providing the infrastructure that's needed to actually transfer huge amounts of data across any network. Now, interestingly enough, with 5G in place, Gartner predicts that the number of internet connected devices is actually going to grow from about 14.2 billion to about 25 billion by the year 2022. Now, because of the 5G capabilities and those unbelievably quick download speeds, that new decade could in essence see a sort of new form of cyber arms race develop, where these lightning fast collection speeds end up facilitating the speed of machine speed and automated attacks. So for example, ransomware that lands in a network long before they realize that anything's amiss, does all that damage, can rapidly exfiltrate data, and that's really going to get sped up through that as well. We've also got this whole IoT conversation, and that's really turning to a widening of the sort of perimeter, that traditional perimeter of the network, right? We've got a lot of shadow IoT, things like smart fridges, things like Formula One cars tied to sensors and things as such. So with all of that kind of technology, right, we're going to start to see it's going to be difficult for IT teams to actually protect and sort of cover and have visibility over these different environments. Now that kind of ties into my second point here, which is this broad adoption of cloud computing and then obviously these evolving hybrid environments that IT teams are increasingly dealing with. So obviously, historically speaking, we've always been, on premise, and now we're shifting and getting everything into the cloud. And obviously, cloud computing and applications offer, much more efficient, affordable, and scalable solutions to modern digital problems, right? And so that's had a hugely significant impact on how network perimeters are being redefined. Now, cloud computing in many instances is a really influential strategic driver for new global business models. And part of that shift to remote data centers has actually been driven by businesses seeking efficiency gains, corporate innovation centers launching digital transformation projects, etc. Now, unfortunately, there's often a single security team, depending on the size and maturity of the organization, sometimes even one or two resources in isolation, that are responsible for securing these workloads across multiple different applications and environments. Protecting Azure, Dropbox to on-premise data centers, virtual environments, and everything in between. And so this has also created quite a serious gap in the visibility and the levels of control that security teams have become accustomed to when managing sort of these traditional on-premise networks as we shift to the cloud. And often that leaves them completely blind to, for example, cloud-specific threat vectors, whether that be fast-moving, untraceable malware exfiltrating data, insider threats, compromised credentials, etc. Notably, what we did see from our own statistics amongst our own customer base is that in the last year alone, we've seen a 28% rise in the volume of threats being pivoted and targeting against cloud and SaaS applications. So we've definitely seen a pretty notable trend in that direction as well. What's more, there are also steady changes to the attacker motivations, right? And specifically here, the industries that are being targeted. Now, traditionally, attackers have been quite focused on stealing data, obviously trying to monetize that, try and get a quick buck, ransomware, etc. However, what we're starting to see today is there is this trend towards much more sinister attacks with much more sinister consequences. Specifically, attacks that now involve sabotaging and disrupting technology systems which support critical and public infrastructure. For example, targeting the network of IoT devices that might be tied to life-saving equipment in a hospital, or ransomware that deliberately targets and shuts down OT processes running in a nuclear power station. Of course, the consequences there can be extremely deadly. And as we're starting to see attackers focus more attention on breaching these industrial environments, we're going to, of course, start to see that reshapes the conversations that businesses are having about protecting those as well, irrespective of where those might sit. Now, ultimately, all of these important technological innovations are going to facilitate really immense change, and it's going to completely reshape that traditional threat landscape. Now, a combination of those factors, the 5G, the IoT, cloud adoption, and then the changing attacker motivations, those are all going to precipitate a paradigm shift for both the offensive and defensive use of AI. So a new cyber landscape, essentially, where there are these more powerful threat vectors everywhere, and we're never really sure if we're on top of them, if we're leaning on that current approach. All right, so just jumping onto the next slide, before I dig too much into the whole offensive AI conversation, I think it's important to understand, this is where we are today and what's coming next. So when we're thinking about, offensive AI, and this is really where we're starting to see some real powerful and quite concerning breakthroughs from the attacker community, is, why would attackers want to start leveraging offensive AI? And the answer is quite simple as it stands. So it's a natural evolution of the way that attackers work today. Now, what I mean by that is, it relies on the principle that attackers, like most of us, are inherently lazy, or at the very least, motivated by financial gain, return on investment, return on time, etc. So if you want to launch an attack, you're typically going to be weighing up, the cost of the attack versus the value of the target that you're trying to go after. For example, a high value target, let's take Garmin as an example, they're quite topical. They were targeted with a very strong, powerful, dedicated attack campaign. This is very much conducted by your traditional attacker type, the guy in the hoodie who's sitting hunched over a keyboard and he's manually trawling through your network, exploring and exposing vulnerabilities and sort of starting to weaponize any vulnerabilities in that environment to achieve their mission objective. Now, the couple of things about these attacks is they're extremely hard to detect. If they want to get in, through those mechanisms, they can do so very easily. They're obviously quite manual given the targeted nature. And given that they're so targeted and manual, there's a large amount of resources and time that go into them relative to this sort of broad-based, spray and pray attacks we see typical of email phishing and things like that. Now, the whole motivation behind why the attackers are wanting to change this is really to make that process easier. Automating a lot of that manual legwork that previously would categorize a more targeted attack. We're going to start seeing this being leveraged at scale with a lot of these offensive AI applications as well. Now, for example, if you think about social engineering, right? An attacker is going to go and target Garmin. They probably did a bit of social engineering, looking into that ahead of time. They'll trawl your LinkedIn profile, your Facebook, etc., trying to understand, who exactly you are. And they can use machine learning and AI to actually automate a lot of that process. The automation and the researching and the target side of things. You could perform that initial social engineering, trying to plug a whole lot of data in about you and get that to pop up with a bit of text that would sound plausible if this was somebody that might know me and they were trying to impersonate me, but of course has actually just been generated using this collection of data that is about me. So that could also end up going further. We could see offensive AI applications being used to replace some of the functions that attackers normally leverage on inside of a network. They could do this with lateral movement, for example, where they try and get a foothold in the network, look for ways to expand inside a company, but they could do that in a much more subtle way without relying on communicating back across command and control channels, C2 channels, for example, which of course immediately make it much more difficult to detect. If we've got a malware that's operating and moving around in the network that doesn't have to connect back to a C2 domain, it's going to make it much more difficult for the traditional signature database approach to pick up, hang on, this is a rare domain that we don't normally see because it's also blacklisted, and we would see that that's indicative of a malware attack type. So that's one of the other concerning applications that we're really going to see around this as well. Now, the most significant technological innovation is the sort of near reality of AI-enhanced malware, which I briefly described now. And it's obviously got a far superior attack mechanism for every stage of the kill chain. I touched on natural movement. I've touched a little bit on that sort of initial social engineering, reconnaissance. But it's also going to include some really powerful automated decision-making, more efficient and evasive data exfiltration. And that's something that we're certainly going to see, emerging in the latter half of 2020 and beyond. Offensive AI hits businesses at a scale and speed, or is going to hit, businesses at a scale and speed that has never been seen before. This is going to target a network and leverage available contextual information it gathers while deployed in that network to decipher, where the most vulnerable data lies, what the best way to, propagate itself across that network is. And it's going to do that in a way that deliberately tries to avoid traditional signatures and rules-based detection mechanisms. So, a good example there is, we're seeing increasingly sophisticated strains of ransomware, data destructive malware, showing some of the early hallmark signs of this. Automated attacks against internet-facing devices have huge financial and reputational impacts, and they're going to combine multiple payloads. Things like botnet ransomware are going to become a thing. Coin mining and worm-like malware that has self-propagating capabilities, for example. Maybe a good example of this sort of real-world application would be the recently detected XBash malware. We've seen that target both Linux and Microsoft Windows servers, and it demonstrated how threat actors are starting to deploy this sort of nascent automated decision-making capabilities to increase the coordination of those attacks as well. Now, in the near future, we're going to see that AI-enhanced malware become increasingly capable of autonomously and intelligently choosing whichever method appears to be most successful for the target. And that could be picking up after it gets into a network that there are a certain number of things that haven't been patched, automatically then saying, okay, well, let's exploit that. And it'll do that without broadcasting, like I said earlier, back to a command and control service. So it's really going to increase the attack speed and efficiency at every stage of the kill chain. Now, I've spoken quite a bit about what that would look like with an on-premise network deployments, etc. But maybe a really good way of illustrating this is to use email as an example. So on my next slide, I'm going to show you a pretty straightforward example of what a traditional phishing attack looks like, right? The normal day-to-day stuff that we see, that same old sort of spray and pray approach. Now, if you have a look here, it's pretty obvious to pick up that this is a pretty poor attempt at crafting a phishing attack, if I say so. We can see the pretty obvious spelling mistake and incredible. We can see the high levels of solicitation involved there too. It seems like I've lost my screen there. Let's just get that back. Awesome. So, as businesses, large and small, we've got to be more prepared for sophisticated impersonation attacks that are hitting employee inboxes. Attacks that are going to be very soon leveraging AI's enhanced capabilities. Now, to understand the extent to which AI-enhanced spear phishing emails are going to problematize this threat landscape, I think it's first important to look at what a typical campaign actually resembles. So we can see there that the sender seems fairly legitimate. The enterprise sounds pretty legitimate as well. ABC, Lunitrim. The SSL store is there, Patrick Noe. But ultimately, there are some pretty obvious spelling mistakes, like I mentioned earlier. And these are quite indicative of a campaign that's been programmed by the attackers that are either unable to or are just not disciplined enough to invest their time in ensuring correct and therefore believable spelling, grammar, the right levels of personalization that would make a click-through rate to actually download the malware payload that's been embedded in these links feasible. Now, we're seeing obviously 94% of threats there and thereabouts originate in the inbox. You can see that in the bottom right. Depending on who you speak to, it's anywhere between 90 and 94. But what we can say definitively is that that's certainly where most of the attacks are getting through. Now, what's quite concerning is how offensive AI is going to increase that click-through rate by really starting to blur the lines of what seems legitimate and what doesn't. And when I jump over to the next slide, you're going to get a really good understanding of what that looks like. So this is an example of an AI-enhanced phishing attack, the kind of thing that we're going to expect to see more and more in the future. Now, we're starting to see elements of this, but this is really a really good example as to where we see this going. Now, this whole email is entirely legitimate seeming. The context comes from a very believable source. In this case, it looks like it's possibly even an account takeover attack if we're contextualizing it that way, because it's come from someone that seems to be a known sender. Now, in this case, the mail was delivered successfully through the email gateway because the attacker, instead of targeting the business from a random email, decided to target a third-party supplier that works with that business, took over their account, and has now seemed to have crafted a plausible response to the last email as part of this email chain. But there are a couple of unfortunately malicious subtleties here. And it's quite difficult to discern, right? You'd be looking at this, and if you'd read the last few emails in that chain and you're expecting to receive a reply to your last mail, this comes through, the chances of a user that might not necessarily even be uninformed is still going to be high, that they're going to click on this mail and compromise the business. Now, it's going to become increasingly common as we see AI used to generate automatic spear phishing campaigns that expertly imitate that natural language of trusted colleagues. We're going to see the creation of deep fake videos. We're already starting to see that, but that's going to be weaponized in email audio content that might seem real, for example, but it's entirely fabricated. This is all going to start picking up as well. And advanced spear phishing emails like this one are going to become increasingly successful at improving the speed of exfiltration of sensitive documents and compromised administrative access to target environments. So in short, I suppose AI-driven phishing attacks are already going to become highly contextualized, incredibly customized, and very believable improving campaigns, both in terms of scale and stealth. I think ultimately it's an entirely new approach that we are going to need to be taking as organizations, as businesses, that acknowledge that complexity of the digital environments and the sort of paradigm shifts that we're moving into, if we're going to counter some of these more sophisticated attacks as well. And that's really the space where Darktrace has emerged from and where our company has started to derive a lot of our success, as we look to not only optimize the protection of environments where we are right now, but also try and provide that robustness going into the future, and certainly creating strategies for organizations that are sustainable in terms of combating these. So if I jump onto the next slide, what I'd like to do is touch a little bit more on our approach and really where we see the right techniques and leveraging AI is going to be incredibly beneficial at stopping some of these attacks. So a really good way of explaining this is Darktrace has got our core product called the enterprise immune system, which is of course analogous to the human immune system. If you think about your body, all right, you have this innate sense of self, right? Your body knows when something other like a virus or flu or bacteria, enters into that immune system, and it realizes, well, okay, I've got a headache now, I might have a fever, all these weak indicators of the threat that obviously point to the core problem within your immune system, the fact that the body's being attacked by this virus or bacteria. Now, again, your body is entirely self-learning, there's no rules or configurations there. It's able to detect this because it realizes that there's something other in the body that's making it behave in an unusual way. And that's really what we've applied and done with, the traditional IT networks, cloud, IoT and SaaS, OT networks as well, is we learn what normal behavior looks like for a user in the cloud or a device on the network. And if we see that mathematical deviation from normal, we'll actually flag that. And that relies on an understanding of, for example, my laptop that I'm presenting off of now, how many IP addresses does it normally communicate with, at what times, how much data flows between my device and perhaps the server that's sitting at our company HQ in Cambridge. Thousands of these different metrics across different layers are going to build up a profile of what I actually understand, whether I'm looking at, how I behave in the cloud, how I behave in my on-premise device. Can obviously pivot there as well. Now, that's got to continue change and update, right? Because I myself, I'm all the time. We've seen, obviously, with the coronavirus, for example, a massive shift to remote working. It's obviously why we're on this webinar and not face-to-face in a panel discussion. And as a result, we're going to start to see users needing to adopt things like cloud technologies much more frequently. And because of that, it's very important that we're able to understand, looking at only these behavioral indicators, whether or not we're seeing a malicious change. And that's going to allow us to detect completely new, novel, unknown zero-day attacks as and when they hit the network, and give us the ability to do so in real time. Now, what's quite important about that immune system approach is it also gives absolute visibility across every device, every connection, every incident. If we're able to model that behavior, then of course we're going to be able to see things that traditional rules, signatures, heuristics-based tools might actually miss. For example, in the case of the email there, where we had the account takeover of the third-party supplier, that came across and the email address was whitelisted behind the email gateway. So of course it circumvented all those sort of traditional perimeter controls, kind of akin to one's skin. And that's where this immune system approach, what's actually happening in my body, in my network, in my digital estate, it's important to see what's going on in real time. And then of course to be able to quickly and adequately respond at machine speed. Now, jumping to my next slide, I think the important thing to notice on carrying on with that whole immune system analogy is that when we have that detection in the body, immediately we have antibodies that latch on in a very targeted and precise manner, going after the virus, the bacteria, etc. Crucially, it doesn't shut down the whole body though. You might be a little bit more slow, you might be a little bit more sluggish, for example, in human sense, but you're certainly not going to just completely shut down. And so this is really where using defensive AI is going to start having a massive impact on balancing business continuity with, again, proactively and in real time mitigating the risk of these cyber threats. Now, this is really where we created Antigena to fill a gap. Now, Antigena is that autonomous response capability I mentioned earlier. Where we see a mathematical deviation in the normal pattern of behavior, Antigena steps in to surgically and in a targeted manner block only the malicious connections associated with that deviation in normal behavior. And that would, of course, mean that if we're seeing, for example, ransomware hit the network, a user clicks on a malicious email, all of a sudden their device starts going haywire, scanning different IPs on the network, connects to a file server and starts rapidly encrypting across 445. We're immediately going to see that this is really unusual behavior for that device. It doesn't normally do those things. And as a result, Antigena then steps in without any human intervention whatsoever, and at machine speed, surgically shuts down those connections associated with the ransomware attack, essentially stopping it in its tracks and buying the human team the time that they would need to respond and catch up adequately, and obviously lead into your incident response as well. Now, crucially there, I've touched on the fact that it reacts faster than human teams and that there's no impact on normal legitimate business activity. right? So business can continue as usual. And that's quite a key factor going forward that we need to be considering as businesses. Again, how do we balance that business continuity with the proactive mitigation of risk in real time? Now, importantly, that autonomous response capability for those of you on the call that are part of bigger organizations that might have security operations centers, SOCs or NOCs, you're going to have the ability to feed a set of behavioral-based anomaly alerts that no other tool can provide. Because Darktrace fundamentally doesn't rely on rules and signatures, when it pushes that across, it's going to be giving you a feed that other tools might simply have missed. And that's a very important component. There's also the ability to have the autonomous response capability passed down the line as well. You're integrating with your EDR, for example, to take actions and update different rules and policies, whilst it also stops that attack in real time. So it's giving you that flexibility to have an AI autonomously respond in the ways that you want it to as well. Of course, it's highly customizable and configurable. And ultimately, at the bottom there, you can't bring a human to a machine fight. That really rings true. At the end of the day, we need to combat these machine speed attacks, which are only going to be enhanced by things like 5G and IoT, like I discussed earlier, with the machine speed response. And that's really where defensive AI comes in, being able to detect in real time an anomalous activity happening on the network without needing to rely on the traditional rules and signatures approach. And then secondly, and maybe most importantly, allowing businesses to respond with an AI without needing a human to actually be looking at a UI or to accept or approve a command for that action to go through. So even if an attack hits the network at 11:30 at night on a Saturday, you can rest assured that the business is covered with the capability that the defensive AI can provide. I think on my final point then, and really where we see defensive AI adding a lot of value, is also speeding up the time of investigation. How quickly can users investigate what's going on? And jumping to the next slide, I just want to kind of wrap up with our AI analyst here. So this is something else that we've launched, and it's another world first from our teams out of San Francisco, Cambridge, and Singapore. And this is all about augmenting that standard investigation process. So kind of like automating a lot of the manual investigation that a human analyst in a SOC would do, and instead giving that task over to AI. So much like in the offensive AI side, where the attackers are trying to use AI to maybe automate a lot of that social engineering, etc., we're going to be using defensive AI to automate the speed of investigations, allowing a human analyst to come much further down the line in the attack chain, in the investigation process, and pick up where the AI has done that initial legwork. And that's, of course, going to be uncovering things that human might miss as well. We're obviously humans, we're going to suffer from sort of human valitude. And that could be, I haven't had enough cups of coffee today. I'm trying to respond to a ransomware attack that hit my network, and the business is putting me under pressure to produce a report like lightning fast. So there's always that margin of error that's going to come in, which of course an AI, of course, won't be able to mix. Now, what we did is we actually put down sensors, essentially tracking every keystroke, every mouse click, and the investigations that were performed by our own analysts across our 3 24/7 SOCs in Cambridge, San Francisco, and Singapore, to understand, how were they going about investigating that, and then to use predominantly supervised ML to actually build out that capability and automate that. So, where that initial role of a human analyst can be performed, it's going to do that to the same standard, but it's going to do that in seconds rather than, the hour and a half, 2 hours it would take a normal human analyst to go and process that. The other important thing there is that it doesn't sleep. It doesn't need coffee like me as well. It's going to be investigating 24/7, 365 in real time. As it gets new contextual information, this device is behaving unusually. Now, 2 seconds later, another 10 devices on the network are showing the same patterns of attack. An AI analyst is automatically going to be able to tie these together and start triaging, and ultimately culminate in producing a human readable report that's going to allow incident response to kick in much more quickly. And crucially, what we've seen with the customers which we've deployed this into right now is we've observed up to 92% reduction in the time it's taken them to triage threats from the initial detection to that first report. So very, very important to start looking at some of those capabilities going forward. How are we going to make the workload easier on the human beings that need to manage these estates? Also factoring in, of course, in Africa, we've got a relative skills shortage, much like the rest of the world, in terms of obtaining, skilled SOC and investigation professionals, analysts, etc. as well. All right, so I want to touch on one real world example just before we wrap up and maybe open the floor to a bit of Q&A, because that's often where we get the most value out of this. And I just want to touch on this example on my next slide quickly. Let's jump across. All right, awesome. Now, in this case, I figured it would be quite topical to put this in. Obviously, Telkom here in South Africa was hit not too long ago. And so quite a topical point around how we're going to start to see some of these advanced ransomware strains leveraging on some of this early sort of AI, defensive AI capability. And this is going to showcase how it is going to supercharge attacks and really be leveraged in forms of data destructive malware. So in this context, is one of our customers based in the UK, and at about sort of 7 in the morning on a Friday, one of the employees at this firm, he accessed his personal email account from his corporate smartphone. And unfortunately, he was tricked into downloading a malicious file. And seconds later, we saw that device begin connecting to an external server out over Tor. Now, of course, we know Tor is highly malicious, something that we wouldn't want any user to be connecting to on the network. Now, in this case, Darktrace discovered that a new and advanced strain of malware and ransomware in particular had been deployed. The attack was highly automated. It spread much more quickly than normal ransomware. And about 9 seconds after the start of those SMB encryption activities we started to see across 445, multiple devices and server locations there, we raised a prioritized alert saying that this was an anomalous behavior which required immediate investigation. Now, crucially, in real time, as that behavior persisted over the next 24 seconds, this particular device behaving uncharacteristically and starting to connect and encrypt things, Darktrace revised its understanding of the deviation, judging it to be an active, fast-moving threat. Now, in this case, unfortunately for them, the security team, they had gone away for the weekend. They'd done a long weekend on a sort of company retreat, and so they weren't in the office, right? Fortunately, though, Antigena was able to step in and autonomously respond in a very surgical and precise manner. Now, what it did here was it interrupted all those encryption attempts surgically, but still allowed normal business activity to continue, uninterrupted. So even though this business had been hit by ransomware, they were able to obviously figure out that they had been attacked and they had visibility over what had gone on, how it had gotten in, etc. But secondly, and most importantly, it was stopped in real time where the machine speed attack was blocked by machine speed response. Now, this kind of attack demonstrates how that sort of nascent automation is being leveraged as part of these new advanced attacker techniques. Digital environments are very often bespoke, and because of that increasing network complexity, they're going to be especially vulnerable to data destructive malware. And I think this attack demonstrates how there's an imminent fundamental reorientation within the threat landscape as to how these campaigns are going to be carried out and how they're going to now leverage more ingenious, custom-made and powerful forms of malware and actually go and deploy this. So I think that's one good example there. I know we are not too good on time, but maybe now is a great time to switch over to the Q&A. Guys, thank you very much for that. Johan?
Warren, thank you. You clearly know what you're talking about. I found it incredibly interesting, also a bit scary. We've got about 17 or so minutes left. A few questions in the Q&A section, also a few questions in the webinar chat. I'm going to start with Mark's question. He says, are you already organized in the Netherlands and a member of the Hague Security Delta?
All right, so I'm not sure if we're a member of the Hague Security Delta, but I do know that we do have customers active in that region. So if you'd like, I'm more than happy to get your details and actually pass it on to the team. But we've done a couple of very successful projects, a couple of things with a bank in Amsterdam, for example, which I can't name, but we actually ran a really interesting red team test with the guys a while ago. So they brought in a proper world-leading test team, a red team from Deloitte, to come and see if they could get into the environment. We put our Antigena email product in place. So instead of acting like a traditional email gateway, it essentially leverages those same AI capabilities that are described that apply to the network, learning that normal behavior, understanding, things like natural language processing, how I would normally communicate over email, the times it gets sent, the legitimate senders, and so on and so forth. And so they were supposed to run this over a period of a month, get the attack up and running, get this in via email, move around the network, see if they could compromise. And the first day of the attack, what happened is apparently they the bank tried to phone these guys at Deloitte, and no one picked up the phone, no one responded, which they thought was quite strange. Anyway, they left it, trying to contact the guys. And the second day, in the morning, the guys from Deloitte actually phoned them back and they said, you know what, we actually can't get in. Now, because they deployed anti-Genie email, unlike a traditional gateway, which would sort of look at that email at a single point in time, cross-reference various elements in that email against known threat signature databases, apply different rules, etc. to that. It had gone past their gateway, but unfortunately, the high level of customization and impersonation was actually caught by the defensive AI, which realized that there were very subtle changes in the normal language being used there and was actually able to block it. So it's quite a cool story from the Netherlands. Ultimately they gave up their 18 test there. And we're certainly very active in the market, so I'd be more than happy to put you in touch with the guys that side after the call.
Next question is from Jose, and he actually asked the question I was going to ask as well. Do you still need your traditional antivirus software to run concurrently with this defensive AI software? Would you say it replace all other antivirus software that might be used in a corporation?
No, I would say replace is a really strong word. I think what it's going to do is it's going to augment those capabilities. Now, I think the other thing that a lot of the sort of standard security tools that we've brought in place also provide is that ability to customize policy and tweak sort of bespoke environments and add that layer in as well. Certainly there are going to be your sort of generic strains of ransomware, malware, etc., which are going to be picked up by threat and signature databases, and they still have a very important part to play. So I would certainly say the technology augments that capability, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that it would outright replace a traditional antivirus at this point. Certainly, I think there's a lot of sophistication that's being leveraged against businesses, but we're also still seeing a large amount of attacks at scale. And that's really where the antivirus, your traditional email gateways, etc., shine, is sort of combating a lot of those sort of standard generic types of threat, where the AI machine learning is really going to come into play at the moment is going to be around uncovering, the more malicious and sophisticated types of attacks. I think what we probably will potentially end up seeing as time goes on, though, is as we see greater adoption by attackers of offensive AI tools and techniques, I think we might see the antivirus start to sort of wane and enter a sort of leave its honeymoon phase, I suppose. And that's maybe where businesses will probably want to turn to it. But at this stage, I think in the current context that we're in, I'd certainly recommend a good blended approach there.
Super. Next is a question from Anonymous. Does this mean we still need cyber AI analysts in the organization, or that we need them rather? So let me repeat that. Does this mean that we need cyber AI analysts in the organization, or do you provide that service?
All right, so to distinguish here, in terms of Darktrace as an organization, the cyber AI analyst comes as part of our sort of core bundling, the enterprise immune system. So there's no additional charge there from a commercial standpoint. From a sort of consulting standpoint, I'd certainly say that AI analyst capability is going to be immensely valuable to any business. If you're looking at a business, on the bigger end of the scale that might have a fully fledged SOC or NOC, it's going to free up a huge amount of the legwork that those analysts need to put in investigating and triaging threats. We've seen that in our own SOCs across Cambridge, Singapore, and San Francisco, as well as in the customers where we've deployed this. I think it does, a couple of things. I think it speeds up, how quickly we can understand what's going on in the environment. And then secondly, it's also going to translate these into a really meaningful narrative. So you can actually have this AI analyst investigating 24/7 in the environment, and it's continuously producing human readable reports for you, joining disparate model breaches across the Darktrace UI into the single fully fleshed incident report, which you can quickly share with senior executives. And the AI is actually able to produce that report with a little bit of human readable text that is super easy and intuitive to understand. So it's going to speed that up as well. Now, on the sort of lower end of the scale, smaller businesses, where you might have one IT manager or security officer that's typically responsible for this big sprawling digital estate. You need to cover cloud, you need to cover IoT, SaaS, on-prem network, etc. The AI analyst is an absolute lifesaver because it's going to literally give that expertise to businesses, particularly in Africa where we do have the skills shortage, the capability to start having those conversations meaningfully with management about what's going on, to quickly understand what's going on, importantly, and to have the capability to combat those threats. So with especially, anti-Genie coming into the picture as well, they'll, in both cases, whether we're talking a fully fledged SOC or a one-man IT band, have the capability of actually having these attacks stopped in real time, balancing that business continuity aspect with it, and then buying the team's time to catch up. So I'd certainly say that there's that value there. To come full circle, in terms of whether or not we do have an additional support service, we do. Those 3 SOCs in Cambridge, San Francisco, and Singapore do support a number of our customers. We, for example, have a 24/7 proactive threat notification service, which is designed specifically to detect fast-moving threats within the network. So even though those alerts might be generated on the enterprise immune system, those get pushed to mobile app, they get pushed over email, SMS. Sometimes people do miss them. And what we would essentially have is a human analyst that's investigating that in real time, combining the intuition and expertise of the AI analyst, produces a report, and they would actually pick up the phone and reach out. So there is that sort of direct touch if needed.
Here from a user called Birut Temtem. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And I love this question because it's for me quite philosophical in a way, but very real. It says, what happens when a program that can rewrite its own code diverges from the intentions of its creator to achieve its goal?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree, very philosophical. I think for me, we're still quite a way away from that sort of level of sentience where the program's going to be able to rewrite its own code and sort of diverge from the intents of its creator. I think what's going to happen here is the way that the algorithms are going to be structured, certainly with the initial wave of offensive AI, means that it's more about automating the decision-making processes that a normal attacker would take if they were sitting, mouse and keyboard, going after your business in a targeted way. So just like a human attacker or hacker might sit down and say, okay, let's have a look at the environment, let's move around and gather information. They're using these various applications. Are those applications patched, yes or no? If they are or aren't, it changes the ways that the attacker is actually going to start leveraging on those to move around the network. So that's really where I think the current trend in offensive AI is moving towards. We're going to see a lot more of that. I think we're still quite a long way away, though, from getting that sort of sentient AI that can, break away from the intentions of its creator, expand and maybe wipe everything out and encrypt well beyond what it's supposed to be doing. They're still very much bound by the algorithms that are created by the human hacker in this case. So fortunately, I think we're a little bit far away from that. And to be completely upfront with you, it's a bit outside of my realm of expertise if we're looking at that from that perspective.
It's true, and I love that topic. I love this whole future philosophical view, and there's some amazing authors to follow. But I think from a practical point of view, we don't really know if and when that's going to happen. I want to combine 2 questions here, one from Siabonga and one from Anonymous. Siabonga said, the opportunity of any malware that can use this information to mimic some of these countermeasures is great. What is the likelihood of these being used to attack our networks, basically using your defenses against you? And then I want to combine it with what Anonymous said, and now hang on, it's all in answered. I just want to quickly find that question. What will happen if one of your resources defect to these guys? Will Darktrace not be exposed? Are there plans to mitigate the risk? So I think a good question is, what happens if all this great stuff you are doing somewhere or another is being used against your customers, organizations you're working with? Is that possible?
Look, I mean, nothing's impossible. I think what I will say is this: as far as being a top security company and being the world leader in AI and cybersecurity goes, a large portion of our company is very much entrenched in the security community. So a lot of former MI5 GCHQ guys, for example, we've got one of the former director generals of MI5 on the board. We've got Alan Wade, the former CIO of the CIA. He's sitting on our board as well. So, I mean, we've got quite a strong pedigree in that region. I think that the likelihoods of anything being stolen from the business and weaponized against us are incredibly low. That said, I'm never going to be able to sit here and say that it's impossible. I mean, stranger things have happened, of course. But the security processes and policies that we introduce internally are incredibly rigorous and up to scratch with those standards. We work with a number of, for example, government agencies across the US and UK, Europe, here in Africa as well, where we protect central banks, infrastructure, things like ATM networks in countries where we're covering. So the criticality of the data that we're protecting is, of course, incredibly severe. But that said, the controls and processes that we put in place in our back end to mitigate the risk of something like that happening are definitely enough to offset that risk appetite for those guys as well. And I think for most businesses, they're also pretty comfortable with those odds too, I'm sure. So not a question we get asked often, to be honest, but one that is there. And then to come back to the first question. So looking at whether or not we're going to start to see weaponization of your own applications and processes and things in your environment being weaponized against you, I would say there's a fairly strong chance of automation coming into play there. I think we're already seeing a lot of attackers, exploit vulnerabilities and things. We saw the Zoho managed engine vulnerability being exploited. We're on Zoom at the moment. I think we've all heard of Zoom's issues with the same thing. So very much so. I think what we will see is, attackers deploying this sort of nascent automation, this offensive AI into networks, and it's going to be told to go and look for this kind of stuff specifically. It's often the best way to actually go about moving across an environment, because if they're living off the land, as it were, they're using your own technology, by its very nature, it's going to be much more difficult to detect using a traditional rules or signatures-based approach, because all of this is expected. It's whitelisted. It's something that we would see normally in the environment. So absolutely, it's a great question, and certainly something we're going to be seeing.
We almost need to wrap up. I've got a question for you, Warren. If I represent a business that's interested in utilizing your services, what would that engagement typically look like? I assume there's a upfront consultative engagement, and then there's, whether it's license-based, or how does this work? Tell us just high level, what does it look like to engage with your organization?
Awesome, thanks, Jan. It's a great question and a very important one, I'm sure. So the way that we typically do this is this 30-day proof of value, which you can see on the bottom of the slide that's up right now. Now, this is in essence a free trial that we run with customers, and the way that engagement would work is we would come in, we'd have an initial meeting, we talk about the detailed level, but it's really about unpacking, what is unique about the environment that we want to deploy into. There's this blend of cloud, SaaS, IoT, what's unique about that business and what's the best way to protect. We'll also look at, of course, the most pressing problems that the business is facing. Some customers we come into, and particularly at the moment in South Africa, for example, we're seeing a lot of businesses being bombarded with really advanced spear phishing campaigns, bypassing traditional email gateway tools. So, for example, we'll come in there and we'll talk about how we can address those challenges of cyber AI. Once we determine what the right sort of product mix is that's going to best be able to support that environment, we would then run a free 30-day trial. We would essentially give usage of that software, that UI, and we deploy in the environment, whether we deploy virtually or on-prem appliance, to get that up and running. We then actually go a step further. So we actually produce a series of reports for our clients, bespoke and tailored to their environment, where each week, for one of 3 weeks, we would release a report highlighting 2 or 3 interesting, unusual things that we've detected in the environment that perhaps their traditional toolkit might have slipped up on or missed. Now, you can kind of think of the analogy as that being like an AI-driven pen test, right, which we run over that course of the month, uncovering what's going on, and then handpicking a couple of incidents to discuss maybe some of the more salient risks in the organizations that we've deployed. At the end of that discussion, we can obviously have a conversation about whether or not to continue the commercial relationship or not, based on price, need, whatever the case is. But there's no obligation to purchase Darktrace when running that trial. It's something we offer free to all businesses, part of a bigger campaign we're running across Africa right now, which is really about empowering businesses with understanding what's really in their environment, getting a full picture of that risk, and then also starting to see how AI can be practically applied in their businesses to start achieving some of those defensive capabilities.
Amazing. Just before we wrap up, there's a few questions we didn't get to because of time. You can send your questions to info@mlafrica.com. It's info@mlafrica.com. Also go to that website, mlafrica.com. There's a number of very exciting events happening in the near future. So it's worth looking at that and registering. Also, the recording of this webinar will be sent out by email, I would assume in the next day or so. And then Warren, this was really fascinating. It's a pity we don't have a lot more time, but I'm going to connect with you on LinkedIn. I definitely want to chat more. And I think everyone found it very interesting and informative. So thank you for your time and for your team's time. It was amazing.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. And thank you very much to everyone that joined today. The other thing is it's always really great seeing the quality of the questions that came out, and it shows that you guys really engaged with the content. So yeah, hopefully you guys managed to learn a few things, got exposed to a few things that you might not have been aware of. And yeah, more than happy to continue the conversation. Johan, thank you for facilitating as well. It's been great to chat with you this afternoon.